be demonstrating how to create watercolor using ground up chalk pastels or any other synthetic pigment. Now you might think that making paint of any kind is probably a pretty difficult task, but in reality, as long as you have the supplies, it's not very difficult. The first step to creating watercolor is pretty obvious. You're going to need some supplies. So what supplies will you need? Well, first, you're going to need pigment. Now, I like to use the Artist's Loft brand soft pastels, which I grind up to use as my pigment. But any other chalk pastel or soft pastel would do. You can also purchase pigment separately. You will then need a binder. What is a binder? Well, it's in the name. A binder is what's going to bind your pigment together to create your paint. Each medium of paint uses a different binder. For watercolor, the binder is called gum arabic. You can purchase gum arabic in crystal form, which you melt down, or liquid form, which is the easier route, but either one will work. I use the Winsor & Newton watercolor gum arabic. You will also need something to grind either your pigment together if it is not already ground up, or you will need something to grind up the pigment and the binder together to create your watercolor. You can either use a mortar and pestle like I have, or you can use a paint muller. Paint mullers, though, can be pretty expensive, so I like to use this small mortar and pestle that was originally used for cooking, but it has now been repurposed. Lastly, you'll need something to put your watercolor in. I like to use these little cups that fit in this magnetic container from Meeden. These are very nice because you can rearrange them and take them out as you please. Use is a soda cap. This is what I used when I made my first watercolor before I had an official palette to put it in. It works pretty well. And you could even make your own palette out of them pretty simply. Now, the next step will be you will need to grind up your pigment if it is not already ground up. Here is the chalk pastel. Note that this can be a somewhat loud process, so maybe don't do it while someone is sleeping. Once your pigment is ground up, I recommend putting it in some sort of storage container. I'm just using this simple little jewelry storage container, and it works pretty well. As you can see, the pigment is ground up, and it doesn't take that long, so that's good. At this point, if your gum arabic is in a crystal form, you will want to turn it into a liquid for this next step. Now, the ratio of the gum arabic to pigment can vary. It depends on how pigmented you would like your watercolor to be. So I just have a very little bit pigment, not the whole pastel. It is good to have some sort of measuring utensil, even if you don't plan on recording the measurements, just to keep things clean. I am not one for measurements, so I usually do more trial and error. I will start out with about a teaspoon and grind, and later on I might add more pigment or more gum arabic, depending on what it looks like. So here, that's not much paint. So I will add some more pigment and some more gum arabic. Probably more gum arabic than the pigment. You will want to make sure your mixture is completely smooth with no bumps or lumps, or that will transfer over to your paint. You will then be ready to transfer your watercolor mixture into a container. Or you could use it as is. Liquid watercolor does exist. This step can be messy, so you will either want to have a little spout on your mortar and pestle, which I think most of them probably do, or you could use a syringe. See, I made a little mess there. Now comes probably the most tedious step, the drying process. This can take up to a day to dry. I personally like to speed it along with a hairdryer, but that will still take a little while. So patience is key. You'll be able to tell when your watercolor is dry because it will not be shiny. It will be matte-like in appearance. Now, it is important to keep your workspace clean, especially because you wouldn't want any pigment clashing with other pigment if you're trying to make a certain color. Also, it is important to note that watercolor is easily able to be washed out of clothes, unlike to say if you were making oil paint, which would be much more difficult to deal with and will stain very easily. So you'll want to be careful with that. But Akam Arabic easily will come out of clothes. Now I'll be demonstrating how to create your own colors other than just the ground up pastel itself. Now, as I said earlier, I like to keep all my pigments in separate little containers. So, let's say we wanted to make a blue-green. So, take some blue pigment. And some green pigment. Grind that together. Like so. You want to make sure your pigment is completely mixed into each other. And you'll probably want to add more than this. This isn't very much. But experimentation is the key. You can get some very beautiful colors. Mix. Now these are how our colors came out. Pretty cool, huh? I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye now.